Hi. I have a jar, and recently this jar talked to me. It said to me, "Turn me into a little diorama." Okay. Oh, and film it. Of course, the jar didn't really talk to me, but I do make a lot of things. One thing I don't do is film making those things. That explains my setup here with these two wooden blocks to prop up my phone, so I need to fix that. This seems good. So I started that printing. But it was going to take a while. So I had to crank up the speed a little bit. That's better. While that's printing, I need to design the diorama. So I'm thinking we have a base of mud here, and then we have a rock, and maybe the rock's covered in vines. And then as the main event, we have a tree here, and there's a whole bunch of little leaf thingies hanging off the tree. Then I'm thinking we put in a special detail here with a little broken statue half sunk into the mud. And I want to give him a sword, and I want his limbs and head and such to be fallen off. And to put it up to the next level, we can add some other greenery around in the area. That means we need a jar, which we have, a stick, a rock, some greenery, a rock man with a sword, some other greenery, and some mud. To start, let's find a stick. This one seemed pretty good, so I grabbed it. Then checked how the stick would fit. And it didn't really fit at all. So I had to fix that. Meanwhile, at the printer, the print kind of failed. So I needed to retry some things. As for these parts, well, they go in the trash. No. But as I began to start my next print, I suddenly had a realization. I didn't have to reprint the whole thing. So I began my plan. Grab the stuff out of the trash, and I put them on the desk. I began by measuring each piece. After that, using my expert skills in Tinkercad, I created which parts of each print didn't finish. Unfortunately, that one failed as well.
Dang it. Let's see, these other ones printed well.
So I reprinted that piece. All I had to do now was secure the pieces together. That way it created the finished print. I did this with hot glue. Now, this is going to be for my filming. Eventually I have to get to the actual craft, but I needed to get this through and I thought it'd be interesting to film it. After cleaning up the pieces, I had to test them. Unfortunately, hot glue wasn't strong enough, so I had to pull out my 3D printing pen. After using the pen on all of these pieces, I came to discover they didn't work. So instead, I used super glue. after a lot of sandpaper and a lot of time, finished all the pieces. Assembled the tripod. Now I can actually make the craft. So, I pulled out the sticks and I began by figuring out what would fit in my jar. Because obviously the whole stick wouldn't fit. The first stick I tried was too big, so I got a card that fits about the height of the jar. And I found a stick that would fit that size. Placing the stick in the jar, I realized that even though it fit, it was sort of bland. So I set about changing that. Using other sticks and hot glue, I added to this original stick to create a beautiful little tree. Even though one stick broke off, the tree fit neatly in the jar. The hot glue never really stuck well, but I was able to work it good enough so that the tree stuck together very nice. I then set to making the little statue guy. I started by carving him a little sword. Unfortunately, I was unsatisfied with this first sword, so I carved several others to see which one would turn out the best. I then took out some clay and began forming the actual statue. I started by determining a head size and a body size, and then beginning to mold it from a clump of clay about the right size. Using a knife, I separated the limbs, and then the next long while was spent positioning every single little limb into its correct position, including the arm with the sword. The clay I was using was actually air dry clay, so I had to work through this without it drying. This type of clay was also not very firm, so any fine details I wanted to make, I had to make repeatedly and make sure that they were kept as I formed the rest of the body. With that, my little stone man was done. I could form the other things, starting with this rock. Rocks are pretty simple to make, and using a rock, I was able to hit my rock with a rock. Doing so made my rock look very rock-like. I then molded my rock with my fingers to make it more rock-shaped how I wanted, and then pounded it again lightly with the rock. Yep. I then set to making the little leafy bits of the tree. I did this by pulling all of the cotton off of a cotton swab. I was just going to use a cotton ball, but I didn't have any cotton balls. I also don't really like cotton balls, and I can use these cotton sticks for other projects. Now, after pulling apart one cotton swab, which was a painfully long process, I decided to pull apart several more. This left me with a big pile of cotton, most of which I made off camera. Unfortunately, leaves aren't white, so I had to use some green paint and some water to dye this cotton. I'm using the stick from the cotton swab as a stirring stick. See, I'm not wasteful. Now, as a note, I would not recommend trying to dye your cotton swab cotton with green paint. First off, it didn't mix with the water very well, and it also took a long time for the dye to set in, including some really strange drying techniques that honestly were just difficult. After letting it soak for a while, I set it aside to dry for the first time, but I repeated this process multiple times off camera because the paint wouldn't set in the cotton and instead got absorbed by the towel underneath. So I had to re-dye it multiple times. Now, my phone stand that I made earlier in this video wasn't to a T. You see, the instructions for printing included the fact that you could add these two little pen springs into it to make it work better. So, I decided to do just that. Soon enough, my rocks had hardened, and so I began to paint them. I also made two small rocks from the inside of my big rock, and I painted those ones as well. Now I used a watery wash of dark paint, mostly black, but a lot of brown as well, to get into this rock. I also used a darker, thicker wash for the rock after the first wash didn't set very well. I applied the same wash to the stone man and to the stone man's leg, which was separated from his body. I then applied a white dry brush to the top of all of the rocky surfaces to give it a rocky look, I guess. I don't know. It just works. And then, all of my rocks were done. During this time, my green fluff eventually took all of the dye / paint that I had tried to put on it. So now, I was set to the task of gluing it to my tree. Unfortunately, the gluing process was not so nice, and after a long time, I was eventually able to get all of the branches covered in this green sort of stringy moss. To help the mud dry faster, I got a piece of foam to fill in the center. Now this piece of foam had to fit in the jar, so I cut it to the size of the jar using my hot wire. Not as in a car, but as in a hot wire. A hot wire can be used to cut things that get cut by hot wires. Once the foam fit in my jar, I textured it slightly so that it would look nice. Now that I had all of this, and it somewhat fit all together, I did notice that my rocks and stuff were made much larger than I originally intended, but hopefully that doesn't come back to bite me. There's also at this moment that I decided I don't need to add in all of that extra greenery and stuff, so we're just not going to make it. But now, it's time to make some mud. And I realized the best way to make mud is just to use mud. So I grabbed some dirt, and I began to pound it down fine. This was so that it would fit the scale we're working with, and I could also get rid of any chunkies. In fact, my first batch of mud that I tried to make had ants in it. Now, to make this mud muddy, we're going to use glue. This is so that it stays in the shape that we put it in, and it sticks together very nice. To add some volume to this mud, I put in some clay, because clay is naturally found in mud. I also added some brown paint to make it look like it was still muddy when I add it to the jar and it dries. Now I have to put it all together. I actually lost the footage of me putting the mud in the jar. I might not have filmed putting the mud in the jar, because honestly, I didn't want that mud to dry on me, and I was using gloves and it was getting everywhere. So I might have forgot to film that part, but here we are. All I need to do is put in the tree, and everything will be placed in very neatly. The tree was very difficult. I had to break a branch, as you can see, the one closest to the camera. But it turned out well. It looks fine. Now, I had originally thought of getting some sort of epoxy to put in puddles, but I decided against it. But the Elmer's glue puddled up in a weird way that looks like puddles. You can't really see it very well in this video, but there's some sort of orangey grime. Now, I can seal this jar. But for that, I have a special tool. This is a jar vacuum sealer. Instead of boiling the jar and sealing it normally, we can just seal it as is, using air. All I have to do is put the lid in here, put it here on top, press the button. After a bit, it said it would seal, so I pulled it off, and it sure was. Usually jars make a popping sound if you press on their top, but when they're sealed, it's permanently pressed down. And you can see that it doesn't make a popping noise by the popping noise that it doesn't make.